When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I thought as a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. Welcome to the Architecting Through Life podcast, where we dig into principles for building ourselves up as individuals while navigating the realities of this thing called life. The podcast is dedicated to young adults and anyone with the deep hunger to grow in their journey of being all that they were created to be. My name is Ngubeni, and with each episode I'll be discussing thoughts and insights drawn from life, from the Bible, from unique experiences, as well as from other great minds and mentors. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and I do hope that you'll enjoy today's episode. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Architecting Through Life podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I always value any time that someone gives to listening to something like this. So, yeah, thank you. And to jump right into today's topic, so we're looking at a series of thoughts or discussions on this idea of thoughts on manhood. And in today's episode, I want to get into looking at basically the essence of manhood. In the previous episode, I looked at the meaning of manhood. And we basically unpacked what I think was a very basic idea, and basically looking at the idea of manhood or a man being, in simple terms, an adult human male, and understanding everything that comes with. And that was a foundation or setup for looking at this idea of the essence of manhood, which is what I'll be getting into today. And the reason for these reflections on this idea of manhood was based on something that was very personal for me, as a couple of years ago, realizing that, look, one is growing up, one is going to have to assume responsibility, and that if I'm going to be a man, I'm going to have to then be or try to pursue what it means to be a good man, right? And obviously that comes with having to understand what that actually means, right? Sometimes seeing good men, sometimes seeing not so good men, and trying to understand what is the distinction that can make one be a better man, right? Better man for himself, better man for society, better man for one day eventually his family, right? So that is basically the thought behind what drove this, I guess, digging into thoughts on manhood. So to begin with, I want to consider a text from in the New Testament, the 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11, where the Apostle Paul writes there that when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I thought as a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I gave up childish ways, right? So when he was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, I reasoned as a child, but when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. And Paul's distinction there is that the idea of being a man is as distinct or opposed to being a child, right? And that doesn't just happen, right? Manhood comes with taking the intent to put away childish things. So in his point there is that manhood isn't a consequence of just being a male or a consequence of just age and biology, but that it's something that comes with choice and intentional decision that says, I'm going to put away childish things. And that's in that description, the point at which one becomes a man, when they put away childish things. And the essence of manhood that he's describing there has to do with thoughts, with understanding, with reason and speech, right? So when he says, when I was a child, I thought and understood and reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things, he's highlighting there that being a man isn't something that's necessarily biological, but the essence of being a man as opposed to being a child is something that has to do with thoughts, with reason, with understanding, ultimately with the mind, right? As an old poet, I can't remember his name, but he basically makes the statement that were I so told to reach the pole or grasp the ocean with my span, I must be measured by my soul, for the mind is the measure of a man, right? The mind is the measure of the man. So that's the essence of what the Apostle Paul is describing there, that manhood has to do with more than biology, but with understanding, with reason, with thoughts, and with speech, right? And speech being much more than the words that are coming out of the mouth, but the idea that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? So we're looking at the essence of manhood. And when it comes to looking at the essence of manhood, we could otherwise call it the heart of true manhood, right? The heart of true manhood. And to begin with, I want to consider a statement from Genesis, where it says there in Genesis 1:27, and we'll keep this at the back of our minds as we go throughout the discussion, that when God said, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion," right? And God created human beings in his own image. And it says there in the image of God, he created them both male and female. God created them. So human beings were made in the image of God according to the biblical narrative, right? Both male and female were made as human beings in the image of God. Now, obviously, we want to discuss one side of that, that the essence of manhood, right? We want to keep this idea of the back of our minds that both male and female, the essence of manhood is being in the image of God, right? And so to maybe begin the whole discussion, on unpack the conclusion first and then work backwards from there, right? So I want to give the conclusion first and then work backwards from there, that the idea of the essence of manhood, I would otherwise describe it as basically possessing proactive self-control in the context of truth and responsibility, right? It's a very loaded statement, but it's basically the summing up of everything that I'll get into, that being, or the essence of true manhood, or the heart of manhood, as I explore and unpack it, is to be proactive and self-controlled in the context of truth and responsibility, right? That manhood, or the essence of manhood, is proactive self-control in the context of truth and responsibility. Now, I want to unpack that a little and show how these various parts describe the essence of what makes up a man, right? An adult human male. So, the idea of being proactive, basically being proactive is basically being, or having the ability to control or create a situation rather than just responding to it after it's happened, right? It's the opposite of being reactive. In simple terms, to be proactive is to not be controlled or enslaved by your circumstances or mine, right? To not be governed by the things that are happening all around you, right? So think of a child. A child must constantly be dictated to, right? They must always be told how they must live, where they must go, what they must wear, what they must eat. And this is because a child hasn't matured enough to lead himself, right? In fact, there's a text, I think, in Galatians chapter 4, verse 2, that says that if a father dies and leaves his inheritance to his young children, those children aren't any better than the slaves in their household until those children grow up, even though they actually own everything that their father had, right? They are to obey their guardians until they reach whatever age their father has set, right? In another version, it actually says that they are under a tutor and a governor until they reach the appointed time of their father. The idea is that a child, as long as he is a child, even if he possesses an inheritance, he must constantly be governed by a tutor or a guardian because of the fact that he doesn't know any better, right? He is reactive and must constantly be told how to live, how to eat, where to, what to do with his life because of the fact that he is a child, right? Being proactive, though, is unlike a child who must need to be instructed, or like an animal who must constantly be compelled with what to do. Being proactive is being a self-starter, right? It's taking initiative of oneself, right? And that's the idea of what I would describe as part of being the essence of manhood, right? Is that a man is one who is mature enough to know that something must be done even before being told to do so, and then he goes ahead and does it, right? So unlike a child, being proactive is not to be enslaved or governed by the outside world. And that's the idea of being proactive. And I'll tell you why this is important as we go through the thoughts of the podcast or the episode. But the idea that being proactive is taking initiative and not being governed by the circumstances around you and I, right? One of my favorite books, Education, basically talks about the idea that every human being is created in the image of God and is endowed with a power that is akin to that of the Creator. And then it describes that this is individuality and the power to think and to do. And that the men who possess this power and develop it are the men who bear responsibility, right? Men who are leaders of enterprises, they're men who influence character. And that the work of education is to develop this power and to train youth to be thinkers and not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts, right? So being a man, being mature, an adult human male, is getting to the point where you are not governed by the circumstances around you, but realize that you know what needs to be done, you see what needs to be done, and don't need to be told by anyone to do the thing that needs to be done, right? That's being proactive. Second part then is self-control, right? So whereas being proactive is not being a slave to the things outside of me or outside of you, being self being self-controlled is not being a slave to the things inside of you, right? So basically, being proactive is not being a slave to the circumstances around or outside, and being self-controlled is not being a slave to myself, right? Not being a slave to the things inside of me, right? And think about an animal, for example. Animals are moved purely by animal instincts, right? Whenever they mate, whenever they eat, their actions, everything about an animal is governed and dictated to by their animal instincts or animal passions. As humans, or as an adult human male, on the other sense, a man is different from an animal, right? I mean, that's important to note here because unlike animals, humans aren't necessarily meant to be driven by animal instincts, right? Animals are driven by their pure passions, not by reason or understanding, right? And that's why there's a text in Psalms 32 that says, "Don't be like the horse or the donkey, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by a bit and bridle, or else they won't come to you." Right? It's the idea that animals, because they're moved by their animal instinct, right? Their animal passions. When you have to get an animal to do something, you constantly have to force it and control it and direct it because of the fact that it's moved by its animal passions and it knows no better, right? And we as human beings and ideally as men are meant to be different from that in the sense that while we may possess our passions, our emotions, our feelings, and whatnot, we're never meant to be governed by these things, right? And the reason why animals are governed by them is because, as the text says, they have no understanding, right? They're forced by circumstances or by being, directed to have to do what is right, right? And this stems from basically how the mind works. I think I discussed a bit of this in an episode on temptation, if I'm not mistaken, right? And it's the idea that in the mind we possess obviously our passions, our feelings, our appetites, our desires, our wishes, and all of these things. And we also then on the other side possess our judgment, right, which is basically our ability to reason through things and arrive at a conclusion, and our conscience, right, our sense of right and wrong, right. So we've got our passions and we've got our judgment, and we also have the ability to choose our actions, right? Unlike animals, that when an animal is in heat and wants to mate, animals just do their things, right? I had a dog once which we had to make sure that this dog never went out of the yard because if it did, it wouldn't be long before we had puppies, right? To put it mildly, right? But animals are moved by their animal passions, whereas as men, ideally, or as a man, who are not meant to be governed by our passions, but may possess self-control. And one of the marks of a developed man is one who isn't a slave to himself, right, to his weaknesses or his shortcomings, right. And it's not that he doesn't have any weaknesses or that he doesn't make mistakes or stumble at times, but it's to take a position of active combat against the things in one's nature that hinder us from following the truth or carrying out responsibility, right. So that's the idea of being self-controlled. That the essence of manhood, to say it again, is proactive self-control in the context of truth and responsibility. Right? And this idea of being proactive and being self-controlled, what it means basically is to be independent, right? To be an individual, right? To be one who thinks for themselves, who doesn't let others do their thinking for him, who is not governed by what he feels or his circumstances or his passions or his appetites, who doesn't let his hormones do the thinking for him, right? So who doesn't let his circumstances or even other people do his thinking for him? That being a man, in all intents and purposes, being in a position where one is proactive and they take self-control, right? Being proactive and self-control in the context of truth and responsibility. Now, it may be then worth getting into this idea of what we mean by truth and what we mean by responsibility, right? So, this idea of truth, in as much as a man is meant to be independent, right? Not to be dependent on other people in terms of being proactive and being self-controlled. One also knows that he's not all-knowing, right? And I think that's an important part of being independent or being a man, is realizing that I don't know everything, right? And as a result of that, one needs to be governed by principles that are good and necessary in order to succeed in life, right? In living a meaningful and proactive or beneficial life, rather. Right. So, in as much as I'm independent, in as much as you might be one who thinks for yourself, and as much as you might be self-controlled and proactive, there's a certain realization that, look, one doesn't know everything, right? One has limitations. One has certain shortfalls, and as a result of that, one must then give themselves to be governed by good principles in order to succeed in life, right? And those principles, those good principles that are to govern the life in order for it to succeed, that's what I'm referring to as the truth, right? The principle that we follow in order to govern our lives and thus being successful in living it, right? So one who is a man in the sense of being proactive and self-control in the context of truth is one who constantly seeks out and tries to apply these principles and tries to live by them in order then to succeed in life, right? Listen to this thought from the book of Hebrews in the Bible, Hebrews chapter 5:13, that those who are mature are those who through training and practice have the skill to recognize the difference between right and wrong, end quote. Right. So that those who are mature, right, those who are adults, or those who are mature, are those who through training and practice have the skill to recognize the difference between right and wrong. Right. In other words, they have the skill to discern and follow through what is truth. Right. So that those who are mature are able to discern for themselves what is right and wrong. And this comes through, as the text is saying, knowing and applying and practicing of what is truth, right? This is the mark of what it means to be an adult human male, right? A mature human male, right? Being able to discern what is right and wrong, being able to pursue the knowledge of what is right and wrong in an effort to then live by what is right, right? Truth basically acknowledges what is right and wrong and what is best. That's the point I'm making, right? There's a text that says, foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, right? I believe that's Proverbs 22 verse 15, that foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, right? That children are foolish, right? And part of the reason why children are given a lot of patience when it comes to their foolishness is because we understand that they don't know any better, right? That they don't understand any better. For all intents and purposes, they haven't yet grasped truth, right? They haven't understood the consequences of not following the truth because they're children. They're still going to learn. A man, on the other hand, seeks the truth proactively because of the fact that it's essential for you and I to then live a better life or to be a better man, right? And this comes from knowing that my ways aren't always best, right? Our ways as individuals, even when we want our own ways, they're not always best if we're being honest, right? Some of the things that we may say we want, or some of the things that we may say we long for, that we desire, don't always work out for our own good, right? And so it's important then to seek out an understanding of what is truth, what is good, in an effort to then submit ourselves to live by it, right? This can be in any area of life, whether it's relationships, whether it's work, spirituality, health, every area of life. It's possible to know the truth and to live by it. And this comes by being proactive in seeking it out, for lack of better words. Now, it's possible to know the truth and still not do it, right? And this can be either because of a lack of self-control or an ignorance of how to apply the truth. But we'll get into that, right? And so if foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, it's either because they don't know what is truth, or even if they might know, they might disregard what is truth, right? Wisdom, on the other hand, is basically the application of knowledge. It's living by what you know to be true and doing it, right? So foolishness starts with knowing what's true or not knowing what's true, or foolishness starts with not knowing what's true or knowing what's true and not doing it, right? And that's the foolishness that's bound in the heart of a child. And so this idea of manhood is that it's proactive self-control in the context of truth and responsibility. Being proactive and self-controlled in the context of truth and responsibility, right? Quick one on truth, that truth isn't only about knowing what's right and wrong, right? It's also about knowing the truth about my nature, right? About your nature, the fact that there are certain things about you which are meant to be under the restraint of good principles, right? And to not be deluded on this point, right? That there are things which tempt us. There are things about us which, if not governed by right principles, risk being a source of destruction in our lives, right? Truth about the reality of the world around us, right? Truth about the reality of relationships and why we are the way we are as individuals and where we come from and all of those things. Truth in the context, or proactive self-control in the context of truth. That's what I mean when I talk about this idea of truth. Responsibility, then, on the other hand, if the essence of manhood is proactive self-control in the context of truth and responsibility, responsibility is nothing other than being accountable or answerable for your actions, right? And that's basically all it is, being accountable or answerable for something. And that starts with, first and foremost, being our thoughts and our actions, right? Being accountable for my own actions, for our own lives, for our own roles and influences in the lives of those around us, right? So basically, being responsible is realizing that I'm accountable for the things in my own life, right? That my choices and my actions aren't dictated to by either the state, either the church, either other people, but that I, as an individual, am accountable for my choices and my actions, right? And that's responsibility. And so, whereas we've got our responsibility, our first responsibility obviously is to God, and the second responsibility is to those around us, right? Family, colleagues, community, etc. Now, why do I say that? Why do I say our responsibility is to God? Think of it like this. There's a text in the scriptures that says that we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and that each one of us will receive the things that are done in our bodies according to what we have done, whether it be good or bad, right? That should be 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, if I'm not mistaken. It's the idea that we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ and account for our actions and the things done in our body, whether they be good or bad, right? The idea of this judgment, or the idea of the judgment, is actually in honor to our responsibility. It's giving, how do I say, it's highlighting the fact of our responsibility in the fact that our actions have consequences, right? Both good or bad, and that these will catch up to us and we'll have to account for them. Imagine if our actions didn't have consequences, right? Imagine if your effort to try and do something good didn't have consequences of good. Imagine if your pursuit or your actions of trying to be better didn't have consequences of being better. Right? So the idea of this idea of judgment, it's such a deep principle in the sense that it brings about the fact that our actions have consequences which we will then have to account for. And that's responsibility. Responsibility is realizing that our actions are not neutral, right? Everything that you do has an effect. Everything I do has an effect. And part of maturation is realizing that I can account for the effect of my actions. I'm responsible for it, right? I'm the first person who's responsible for my actions. And that's being responsible, right? And being accountable to God. The second part of being responsible of our actions to those around us is also realizing that as an individual, your and my influence doesn't only affect my life and is thus not neutral, that our actions also affect the lives of those around us, right? That everything we do either makes things better or worse, both for ourselves and for those around us, right? And responsibility then is to take up a position of aiming to make things better for those around us in the best way possible, right? Whether it's our families, our colleagues, our communities, and we can broaden that out, But the idea is that our actions aren't neutral as individuals, right? And so part of being responsible is taking up a position that says whatever actions I take, I must account for them. And because I must account for them, I must then pursue what will have the best consequences, both for myself and for those around me, because I won't have anyone else to point to for the consequences of my actions, right? Another way of looking at this idea of responsibility is to think about it in the idea of purpose and service, right? Broad, grand themes of purpose and service, right? The fact that our actions or even our inactions have consequences in the world around us, and that we can actually take up a position where we direct our actions to have the best possible outcomes in our perspective, at least, both for ourselves and for those around us, right? And that's part of the essence of being a man, right? I'll get into another thought when we discuss this idea of going from boys to men, but the essence of true manhood is the idea of proactive self-control in the context of truth and responsibility. And all of these are required in order to fulfill the purpose of being a man, right? Now, a quick side note: this definition of the essence of manhood, one can say, how is this different from the essence of womanhood, right? And at the core, it's really not that different, right? The essence of true womanhood, I guess, is also being proactive and self-control in the context of truth and responsibility, right? Now, where these differ, I'd say, are at two small, or not small, but two main points: the idea of self-control and the idea of responsibility, right? And the idea of self-control is realizing that, look, as men and women, for example, because of our temperaments and our biology, we differ in some instances of where we have to control ourselves, right? So because temperamentally, for example, males can be more aggressive, or they can have more higher testosterone, there's a certain self-control that's required of men, right? Controlling aggression, controlling your temper, controlling your sex drive, controlling the essence of you in terms of your nature, right? That's the essence of your self-control. And whereas, because women, temperamentally speaking, right, generally speaking, women tend to be more empathetic and emotionally sensitive, tend to be more awake to your feelings. There's certain areas of self-control that's required of women, right? So because of those nuances that come with being male and female, we all have to be self-controlled in areas which are unique to our maleness and our femaleness, for lack of better words, right? There's certain inclinations that we have as males and females, both biological and in our temperaments, which we have to exercise self-control in. And knowing these differences and how we experience them as males and females inform the different areas where we exercise self-control. That's in the area of self-control. In the area of responsibility, this idea that as males and females, there are times where we find ourselves in responsibilities that differ because of our male and female nature, right? Males and females, right? And I will admit that it becomes a bit difficult to draw these major distinctions in roles outside of the home, for example. And I don't think that there are really that many, but it doesn't mean that they aren't real, right? So, for example, there's a reason why the armed forces, the army, is mostly men, right, that go to war. As society, we've generally accepted that men are those who initiate romantic relationships, as an example. Like, there's certain expectations that come both out of our biology and out of our temperamental nature, which inform our responsibilities, right? And so the point I'm making isn't to define the essence of manhood as compared or contrasted against womanhood, but in its own right as what it means to be a man. And these principles, I'm certain, can be applied as well to women, right? And listen to the previous episode about why I use the term not contrasting or comparing, right? So the point is to understand the essence of manhood, which I said is proactive self-control in the context of truth and responsibility. And the point I want to emphasize on is the idea that this is what we are created to be, right? Sometimes as people, we can be discouraged by ideals when we think about ourselves as falling short of them, right? At times we can think of the fact that, wow, there's this standard, and it's so discouraging because it's quote unquote high. But I don't think that we should be discouraged by ideals. In fact, I actually think we should be encouraged by ideals because of the fact that that's what we're created to be, right? They show us that our limitations are much broader than what we ourselves think of them to be, right? That we were created as individuals to be proactive and self-controlled in the context of truth and responsibility, right? And that life is filled with responsibility, and we have the ability to be proactive and self-controlled in the context of those responsibilities, right? I touched earlier on the point about being in the image of God. Basically, the point is that these traits are traits which God possesses and which He has given us to possess as well, right? God possesses proactive self-control in the context of truth and responsibility, right? And one of the major pictures of this is if you look at the biblical narrative, what's called the plan of salvation, right? How God saves humanity, right? That when humanity fell into sin, God was proactive in taking the step to save humanity, even when humanity didn't want to be saved, right? It says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, that God sought and was proactive in seeking humanity, even while we wanted nothing to do with Him, right? God is self-controlled in the sense that Even though God could have easily wiped us all out, he exercises patience towards us and mercy, right? He's a God of truth. He created laws and principles which are to govern the universe, and which, to certain extents, he himself allows himself to be governed by, right? There's a whole philosophical discussion there, which, I wouldn't get into. And he's a God of responsibility, right? He cares for humanity, right? And as a loving parent, basically, God acts with the well-being of his children in mind, right? And this is the idea that the Bible presents as what we are created to reflect. And it's obviously too broad for me to even describe in these few sentences, right? But the truth is unfolded daily, right? So, as the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13:11, it says, "When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things." In another episode, I'll get into a further discussion of how we can go from boys to men. But for today's episode, it's an encouragement to say that as a man, you and I were created to bear proactive self control in the context of truth and responsibility. If you'd like to get in touch, maybe share your thoughts, reflections, and feedback, you can feel free to reach me on my email. That's simon@ngubeni.co.za. But other than that, I'm wishing you all the best on your journey of architecting through life. Thank you so much for tuning in. Much love. Thank you for listening to the episode that you've just heard on the Architecting Through Life podcast. If you found it valuable, please kindly do me the favor of sharing it and maybe leaving a comment if you'd like. I'd really like to get your thoughts, any impact that you might feel it may have, and do feel free to share it with someone else so that it can be a benefit to them as well. Thank you so much for your time, and do join us again on the next episode of the Architecting Through Life podcast.